Hello, my name is Yusan Lin. I'm a PhD candidate from National Tsinghua University in Taiwan. Today, I'm going to present our work. Don't look back, look into the future. Prescient data partitioning and migration for deterministic database systems. This work was done with Jin Cai, Ziyu Lin, Yunsheng Zhang, and my advisor, Sanghong Wu. This is the outline today. First, I will introduce the background of our paper and the problem we want to solve here. Next, I will discuss some related work that try to solve the same issues or similar issues like us. And then, I will introduce our system, Hermes, and the experiment results to demonstrate the effectiveness of our system. In the end, I will give a conclusion about the presentation today. First, let's see the background of our work. Many people may have known that deterministic database systems have been proved to highly scalable and highly available. Here is the architecture of a deterministic database system, Kelvin, which was published in Sigma 2012. The key idea here is to first order the transaction request in advance to ensure all the machines can receive this request in the same order. And then each machine in each replica will force its threads to execute this transaction request in the given order so that the resulting database state will be deterministic. As a result, Kelvin does not need to perform any agreement protocol like two-phase commit before committing a transaction. This ensures strong consistency across partition and the replica with much lower overhead than in traditional database system. However, the good scalability of a deterministic database system relies on high quality of data partitions, which means that your database must be well partitioned to ensure good performance. If the database is not partitioned well, there may be many distributed transactions, or the loads on all the machines will not be balanced. This may become a serious problem for deterministic database system because such systems are very sensitive to stored and long transactions. Please check the figure below. This is an experiment showing a paper, the case for determinism in database systems, which was published in VLDB 2010. In this figure, we can see that if we create some stored transactions here, it would dramatically impact the performance of a deterministic database system. While the traditional systems was not affected by stored transaction so much like what we see for the deterministic database system. This shows how important a good data partitioning scheme is for deterministic database system. Also, things start getting worse on a dynamic workload because the best data partitioning scheme in that dynamic workload constantly change. A database management system may have to keep repartitioning its database on the fly over and over again in order to catch up the latest pattern of the workload. This also usually requires the system to perform a dedicated and slow time-consuming data migration in order to move the data from old locations to new locations. Things may get even worse if there are episodic workload changes, which means that there are some unpredictable patterns in your workload. For example, we show the log trace from a Google's cluster. Each line here represents the timeline of loads on a machine. We can see that there are many blasts happening in these workloads. So it may be hard for database systems to keep repartitioning database for such workloads in time. This type of workload may also appear in many other complex workloads such as the trading system of a stock market or a multi-tenant database system. So in order to make a database system adapt to dynamic workloads, we need the following three types of mechanisms working together, which are data partitioning, data migrations, and the transaction execution. However, it is not easy to solve all these three issues simultaneously. For example, many data migration mechanisms may introduce big impact to transaction execution because we want to ensure data consistency during the migration. Or when the system comes out a new data partitioning plan, the new plan may cause a large amount of data movement. Hence, we need to find a way to migrate those data fast. So we are thinking, is it possible to jointly optimize data partitioning, data migration, and the transaction execution for dynamic and episodic workloads in a simple way? Next, let's see how previous work repartition layer database on the fly. We classify those work into two categories: look-back approaches and look-present approaches. Let's first see look-back approaches. The key idea behind this type is to plan new data partitioning plan based on a past workload history. After that, the system will migrate their data to new locations based on the plan. The example system for this type of approaches includes install and claim. The biggest problem of these approaches is that these systems need a dedicated and slow data migration phase to move the data. Because it may take a lot of time, the new data partitioning plan may become outdated after the migration finish. So there is another type of systems. We call it look-present approaches. Such approaches use data fusion to migrate or merge data for recurrent transactions on the fly. The example system include gstore and lib. Because some people may not familiar with such idea, we use a very simple example here to demonstrate it. Here we have two data partitions. Each partition has two records. Then there is a transaction coming. It wants to read record A and write record C. In a data fusion system, it will first migrate all the records it needs. So here is record A and the record C to partition 2. And then transaction 1 becomes a local transaction. Note that record A will stay in partition 2 even after transaction 1 commits. So if there is another transaction has the same access pattern, it will benefit from this. In other words, the system can benefit from temporal localities. However, it also has a very obvious problem. If the system always routes transactions based on where the data are, it will be easy for the data to accumulate in a single machine or a single partition. Let's see an example here. After transaction 1, there is another transaction coming. This time, transaction 2 wants to read record A and write record B. The system will then migrate record B to partition 2. So, as you can see, the system may also route all the transactions to partition 2, which is better for load balancing. Moreover, all the approaches do not consider how to fit data partition for future workloads. So, all these systems cannot react to unpredictable workload patterns in time. Now, let's see how we solve these issues. I will first introduce a key observation, the key idea behind our system, and then the core algorithm that realizes our idea. Our system is called Hermes, which is a joint design that addresses all above issues in a single module with a single technique. So why can we solve all these issues in a single module? The key observation behind this is that once we use data fusion technique, we can guide data flowing to where we want to go by simply routing transactions to proper locations. For example, in the scenario we just saw earlier, record A is migrated to to partition 2 because transaction 1 is routed to there. So we use this idea to control data partitions by routing transactions. In addition, data fusion technique is also very lightweight in deterministic database system. This is because data fusion is to migrate data for each transaction. In traditional database system, this may require an agreement protocol such as two-phase commit, but this is not required in a deterministic database system. Next, let's see how we leverage on this key observation to help the system react to dynamic workloads. In order to react to future workloads, we propose to look into the future. How do we do that? Instead of routing a transaction request at a time, we batch transaction requests and route all of them at once. Why? Because the router can analyze the dependency between future transactions to foresee possible data partitions result from a routing plan. With this idea, the router can find the best routing plan that leads to the best data partitions for future transactions. We call this technique the Prescient routing. We use this simple figure to illustrate the idea. The Prescient transaction router first generates a naive routing plan. It then generates the resulted data partitions from this routing plan, and then it can analyze the overhead of executing transactions on these new data partitions. After this, it can go back to improve this routing plan for lower overhead. So this is the key idea of Hermes. Okay, so now you have a known idea. Next, you may be wondering how to realize this idea. So let's see what exactly the routing algorithm is. Know that we have two objectives for good data partitions. The first one is to make the loads balanced among the machines. And the second, we want to minimize the number of distributed transactions. There are two main steps in our algorithm. The first step is to route transactions such that the number of distributed transactions are minimized. Let's see an example here. This time, we have 3 data partitions. Each partition has 2 records. And we also have a batch of transaction requests here. So in order to minimize the number of distributed transactions, the router may come out a plan like this. Let's see what is the overhead of executing this routing plan. We can see that there is only one distributed transaction will appear in this plan, which is T5. Although T6 has the same access pattern, T6 will not become a distributed transaction because T5 will migrate record E to partition 1. So it looks good, right? However, there is a problem in this plan. In this routing plan, partition 3 has no transaction to execute. In other words, the loads are not balanced. So the next step is to reroute transactions for load balancing. At this point, the router will try to move this transaction with a relaxed condition. We allow the router to create one more distributed transaction in the new routing plan. So the router may come out a plan like this. Okay, so let's analyze this plan. Now the loads are balanced, right? Each partition has two transactions to execute. And we only create one more distributed transaction, which is also allowed. So the router will think it has a feasible routing plan now, and then route transactions based on this plan. Now you may have noticed that, what if it cannot find a balanced schedule under this condition? If this happens, we will relax the condition more until the router finds one. So That's basically how our Prescient routing algorithm works. There are also more that we can discuss. However, we don't have time to discuss this all. So please check our paper for more information. Okay, so let's see how Hermes works compared to other baselines. The first set of experiments was run on a Google workload, which is a very complex workload that we synthesize from the trace of Google cluster. In these workloads, there are many distributed transactions and unpredictable patterns. You can find more details about the setting in our paper. First, let's see the timeline of the throughput of Hermes and the other repartitioning baselines. The red line here is the throughput of Hermes. We can see that Hermes basically outperforms all other approaches. Next, let's see the latency breakdown. Each color here represents the average time that the transaction takes in each component. We can see that the average latency is much lower in Hermes. And also, the scheduling overhead is very low, which indicates that our routing algorithm is very lightweight. The third figures show the resource usage of all baseline systems. In the upper figure, we can see that the average CPU usage of Hermes is higher than other approaches. This is because Hermes reduced the number of distributed transactions and balance the loads more, so the system can spend more time on executing transactions. We can also see that Hermes does not introduce additional network usage in the lower figure. Now, let's see how Hermes does in simpler workload. In this workload, there is a hotspot receives 90% of loads, and the hotspot will change every 450 seconds. This figure shows the timeline of throughput for all the baselines. The vertical line here indicates the workload changes. You can see that one of the baselines have almost the same performance with Hermes, but it drops dramatically when the workload changes. This is because when it finds the workload changes, it will need time to collect the workload trace and migrate data to new locations. On the other hand, Hermes can react to the workload changes immediately and adapt to the new workload very fast. Okay, so let's conclude the presentation today. In today's presentation, we propose Hermes based on the following key observations. First, transaction routing with data fusion controls data partitions. And second, look into the future by batching transactions. We show the effectiveness of Hermes on both complex and simple workloads, which demonstrate how fast Hermes adapts to new workloads. That was the presentation today. The slides can be found in the following links. I'm also happy to take any question, or you may ask any question by sending emails to me.